You're crouched in the shallows of a river in southern India, roughly 2,400 years ago. The monsoon has just retreated. The water is warm, brown, sluggish against your shins. Your fingers are raw from sifting gravel, hour after hour, scooping the coarse sediment into a woven basket and shaking it, letting the light stones and silt wash away. Your back screams. Your eyes burn from the glare bouncing off the water. And then, there, wedged between two ordinary pebbles, something refuses to behave like a stone. It catches the sun and throws it back at you. Sharper than water, colder than glass. You don't have a word for what it does to light. Nobody does. Not yet. That's the moment. The first time a human hand closed around the hardest natural substance on Earth, and the story of how we found it isn't a story about jewelry. It's a story about violence, the deepest kind the planet can do. About rivers that spent 100 million years doing the mining for us, and about a species that learned to recognize a treasure it couldn't even scratch. This is the story of how we found a piece of the deep earth and mistook it for a piece of the heavens. To understand how we found diamonds, you first have to understand where they come from. And the answer is nowhere you could ever go. A diamond is just carbon, the same element in the charcoal of your fire, the same element in the graphite smeared across a page, the same element in every living thing that has ever breathed. Carbon is common. Carbon is cheap. Carbon is you. But a diamond is carbon that's been through hell. To forge one, you need pressure that would flatten a mountain and heat that would melt rock. You need to be buried between 90 and 200 kilometers down in the mantle, where the temperature climbs past 1,000 degrees and the weight of the entire crust presses down. Down there, carbon atoms get squeezed so hard they abandon the loose, layered structure of graphite and lock into a rigid crystal lattice, each atom bonded to 4 others in near-perfect symmetry. That lattice is why a diamond is the hardest thing in the natural world. Nothing can scratch it but itself. Now, the strange part. Most of the diamonds humans have ever touched are old. Not centuries old, not thousands of years old. Billions. Many formed over 1 billion years ago, some over 3 billion. Back when the Earth itself was young and single-celled life was the only life there was. They formed, and then they waited. Because a diamond made 200 kilometers underground is completely useless to a human standing on the surface. There's no shovel that reaches the mantle, no mine, no dream of a mine. If a diamond stays where it's born, no one will ever find it. So how did any of them get to us? The answer is one of the most terrifying events the planet can produce. Deep in the mantle, magma occasionally finds a weakness, a crack, a fault, some route toward the surface, and when it goes, it doesn't ooze. It detonates upward through the crust at speeds that may exceed the speed of sound, faster than any volcanic eruption you've ever imagined, tearing a narrow pipe straight up from the depths in a matter of hours. Nothing else on Earth erupts quite like this. Scientists call the rock it leaves behind kimberlite, and on its violent ride to the surface, this magma sometimes rips diamonds out of the mantle and carries them along, so fast they have no time to revert back to graphite, fast enough to bring the deep earth up. That's the only reason diamonds exist in human hands at all. But no human ever witnessed one of these eruptions. The last major kimberlite blast happened tens of millions of years before our species existed. By the time the first human eyes could look for diamonds, the volcanic pipes had gone cold and worn down, their tops eroded away by wind and rain across eons. And that erosion is the miracle, because as those ancient pipes crumbled, the rivers took over. Rain fell, streams gathered, water carved through the old kimberlite and washed its contents downhill. Mud, sand, ordinary rock, and the impossibly tough diamonds mixed in among it. And because a diamond is denser than most stone and harder than everything, it survived the trip when softer minerals were ground to dust. It tumbled down riverbeds, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers, and settled into the gravel beds of the lowlands. The rivers did the mining. For 100 million years, the planet dug up its own treasure and laid it out in the shallows. All a human had to do was find it. And humans did. In one place, first, and for a very long time, in only one place. India. The oldest diamonds known to us came from the river gravels of the Deccan Plateau, in regions like the fabled mines of Golconda, along the Krishna, the Penner, and the Godavari. Sanskrit texts mention them well over 2,000 years ago. The Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft, written around the 4th century BCE, describes diamonds as objects of value and lays out rules for taxing them. Ancient India didn't just find diamonds, it built a whole trade around them, grading and pricing them and moving them along caravan routes that eventually reached Rome. The technique was called alluvial mining, and it's exactly what you were doing, crouched in that river at the start of this story. No deep shafts, no blasting, just the patient reading of gravel, scooping, sifting, washing, and knowing what to look for in the glint. It was backbreaking, monotonous, and completely dependent on whatever the rivers happened to leave behind. They understood something profound without any theory of geology to explain it. They understood hardness. They'd figured out that a diamond couldn't be cut or scratched by anything else, that the only thing capable of shaping a diamond was another diamond. That knowledge alone was worth an empire. And this is the part I find genuinely eerie. Cultures that had no contact with India landed on the same reverence the moment a diamond crossed their path. The Romans imported Indian stones and prized them as unbreakable, believing they held protective power in battle. The Greek word for the material, adamas, means unconquerable, and it's the root of our word adamant. All across the ancient world, the same idea kept surfacing on its own. This stone is invincible, and so it must be divine. They weren't wrong about the invincible part. They just didn't know they were holding the deepest part of the planet. For nearly 2,000 years, the equation didn't change. If you wanted a diamond, it came from India. That was the entire supply of the known world. A trickle of stones washed from a handful of rivers, feeding the appetites of kings, sultans, and eventually European royalty. Diamonds were rare not because the earth is stingy with carbon, but because so few of those ancient volcanic pipes had eroded into rivers where humans happened to be looking. And then, in the early 18th century, the map broke open. The next source came from a place nobody expected: Brazil. In the 1720s, gold prospectors panning the rivers of a region that would come to be called Diamantina noticed strange, bright pebbles among their finds. At first, they didn't even know what they had. Some accounts claim the stones were used as gambling chips before anyone realized they were diamonds. When the truth came out, it detonated the market. India's ancient monopoly, unbroken for millennia, collapsed almost overnight. Brazil became the world's dominant source for the next 150 years. But the real turning point came in the second half of the 19th century in South Africa. This was the moment we stopped waiting for the rivers and went straight for the throat of the earth. It starts around 1867 on a farm near the Orange River, where a child was said to be playing with a peculiar, glittering pebble. A neighbor recognized it. It turned out to be a diamond of over 20 carats, later named the Eureka. A few years later came an even bigger stone, the Star of South Africa, and then the world lost its mind. Tens of thousands of fortune seekers poured into the region. They dug, and this is what changed everything. At a place that became the town of Kimberley, the diggers realized the diamonds weren't just in the rivers. They were concentrated in the ground itself, in strange columns of yellowish and bluish rock that plunged straight down. They were following a kimberlite pipe, one of those ancient volcanic scars, back down toward its source. For the first time, humans were mining diamonds not from the gravel the earth had handed them, but from the frozen throat of the eruption that made them. They dug a hole so vast it's still called the Big Hole, an open pit clawed out almost entirely by hand, by pick and shovel and desperate muscle, one of the largest man-made excavations ever created. We'd finally reached down toward the deep earth and torn its treasure out at the root, but every solution breeds a new horror. The South African rush created industrial mining, and with it came brutal labor conditions and the whole trade folding into the hands of a few powerful companies. An empire built on stones, pulled out of the ground by the poor for the wealth of the few. The diamond stopped being a river's gift. It became an industry, and that industry would cast a long, dark shadow across the 20th century. One last scene. The year is 1905. The premier mine in South Africa. A surface manager named Frederick Wells is doing an ordinary inspection of the pit wall in the fading afternoon light. Something catches his eye, glinting in the rock face just above him, reflecting the low sun. He assumes it's a shard of glass. A prank, maybe, planted by the miners. He reaches up and works it loose with a pocket knife. It comes free in his hand. And it's enormous. The size of a fist, over 3,000 carats of rough, flawless crystal. The largest gem-quality diamond ever found, before or since. They name it the Cullinan. Hold that image. A man on a routine walk, plucking a piece of the mantle out of a wall as casually as prying loose a stone. That diamond had waited more than 1 billion years in the deep earth, been blasted upward in a prehistoric eruption, frozen in cooling rock, and then sat in that pit wall until a single human happened to glance at the right patch of stone at the right hour of the day. It would later be cut into pieces that now sit in the British Crown Jewels, the deepest part of the planet, resting on the head of a monarch. So sit with what that means. Every diamond you've ever seen, in a ring, in a shop window, on a screen, is a survivor of unimaginable violence. Carbon that was buried alive, crushed for 1 billion years, then flung up through the crust in an explosion no human ever saw. A fragment of a world we can't reach, handed to us by rivers and erosion and blind luck. We didn't invent its value. We recognized it, long before we understood pressure, or the mantle, or the age of the earth. A human kneeling in a warm river looked at a stone that refused to be scratched and knew, instantly, in the gut, that it was different, that it mattered. The same reflex fires in us still. We call it the hardest thing on earth. We call it forever. We call it unconquerable. And maybe what we're really admiring, every time we hold one up to the light, isn't the stone at all. It's the story of how something buried, crushed, and forgotten for 1 billion years can be dragged up into the sun. Same carbon, same element as ash and pencil, lead, and living flesh, same as us, buried deep, pressed hard, and still, somehow, brought into the light.